Good morning. May I welcome everyone to the 30th meeting in 2020 of the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee. For those of us here in the Adam Smith room, can I remind everyone that social distancing measures are in place in the committee rooms and across the Holyrood campus. I ask that you all take care to observe these measures over the course of this morning's business, including when entering and exiting the committee room. And can you all put your mobile devices to silent, please? The first item of business is to propose that the committee take items 6 and 7 in private. Does the committee agree to take items 6 and 7 in private?
Agreed.
Thank you. Moving to agenda item 2, today we have before us Graham Day, MSP, the Minister for Parliamentary Business and Veterans, so welcome. And he will give evidence relating to the work of the committee during the parliamentary year 2019-2020. Mr Day is accompanied by 5 Scottish Government officials. One is here with us in Parliament. Stephen McGregor, Head of Parliament and Legislation Unit. 4 also join us remotely. Susan Herbert, Head of the SSI team in the Parliament and Legislation Unit. Jenny Brough, Coronavirus Legislation Coordination Team. Rachel Rayner, Legal Directorate Deputy Legislation Coordinator. And Brian Peddy, Head of the EU Exit Legislation Team, Parliament and Legislation Unit. May I welcome everyone to the meeting. And as technical difficulties brought our last session with you, Minister, to an abrupt end, I'm grateful for your flexibility in rescheduling, and I hope this meeting proves successful, which I'm sure it will. I don't believe you have anything you wish to say at the beginning, so I will just start with a question to you, and then we will move to other members of the team. Now, the committee very much welcomes the continued improvement in the overall drafting quality of secondary legislation, as well as the decrease in SSIs reported under the 3 most significant reporting grounds. The government has clearly been under pressure in the last few months to bring forward legislation quickly to respond to the coronavirus. So what is it doing to ensure that even in these current circumstances, the quality of SSIs remain high?
Thank you, Peter. I think the answer to that is what we have been doing over the period in which I've been Minister, which is maintaining as strict as possible a regime around quality control. I'm very heartened by the content of your report. I approached it with a degree of trepidation because, as you pointed out, everyone has been under enormous pressure over the recent period. I think it's to the great credit of the government's officials, particularly those responsible for drafting, that we have had so few problems. Because I think there is a bit of a misunderstanding. I think we as MSPs know that quite often we've been working from home. It's been different ways of working all around. It's been the same for them, which presents its own challenges. But we're absolutely not complacent at all, as the officials who are on the line here today will attest to. My first question when I spot any error is, how did that happen? We want to maintain the standards that we've set, and I'm optimistic we'll be able to do that, Convener.
Okay, well, thank you for that response. We shall obviously be monitoring that. If I can turn to the question of historical commitments, you've previously given an assurance that all historic commitments will be met by the end of this parliamentary session. Now, we've welcomed the continued decrease in these commitments, but do you still think you'll be able to meet the remaining historic commitments this session, particularly given that what will sure will be a busy run-up to the dissolution?
Yeah, so of the 16 historic commitments, I think there are 3 remaining. We, as you know, are under quite considerable pressure because of Brexit, COVID, and as you say, the run-up to the conclusion of this session. I would be optimistic of clearing 2 of those, and with 1 left. Beyond that, we will make every effort possible to completely meet that commitment that I gave you. So I would be hopeful of all 3, but I'd be confident of 2 of them.
Before I pass on to Mary Fee for the next question, would that one that you're perhaps not confident be to do with the council tax reduction Scotland scheme?
It would never be one of these sessions without the council tax reduction subject coming up, Convener. We have a disagreement over this issue between the committee and the government. That's a long-running disagreement, and a respectful disagreement, perhaps put accurately. I would not anticipate that being addressed in the short term, not least of all because of the priorities we're dealing with in other regards.
My question to our own team is, if there's a disagreement, how do we actually resolve it rather than just using that as an answer? Can you put something forward that we might find a way to resolve this?
I think, Convener, with respect, we have responded to the committee's concern to a degree with the queuing versions that have been set up. Our view at the moment is that we would not look to make any significant amendments to the CTR scheme because of the pressures we're under, and we're also dealing with this universal credit aspect. I mean, in principle, I agree that consolidations are a good thing to be doing. The difficulty with one like this is where you're frequently revisiting it, it becomes problematic. I'm happy to continue to engage with the committee on this, and if you have some constructive suggestions, happy to look at them. But I've got to be honest, in the current situation, we don't see this as a priority.
I mean, I understand that there's been what you might call a patchwork sort of solution applied to it. It's just when I hear that there's a disagreement, I'd like to know whether it's a legal disagreement which can be resolved, or if it's not a priority, then I can understand, where you're saying that. So maybe we won't have a banter here exchanging it, but if you and I take a view that we should try and find a way ahead, whether it's for us or for someone else, to try and resolve it.
As ever, happy to continue the dialogue.
Okay, thank you. Can I now ask Mary Fee to put her question?
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Minister. The committee is keenly aware of the significant amount of legislative work which the government has had to do in response to coronavirus. And during lockdown, this committee has had to balance the need for secondary legislation to be implemented quickly, but also to have the proper scrutiny. So I've got a couple of questions around coronavirus I'd like to start with, Minister. The use of made affirmative instruments during the pandemic has allowed the government to respond quickly to the very many challenges presented by the pandemic. But nevertheless, bringing such substantial changes into force immediately before any parliamentary scrutiny could only be used for reasons of genuine urgency. Can I ask what the government is doing to ensure its decision to use the made affirmative procedure is as transparent as it possibly can be?
Well, I would offer the reassurance that we, the course of action we follow on all of these things is always carefully considered. And I recognise there will be times that others might take a different view on the approach that we've undertaken. But I would point out that there has been no unwillingness on the part of the government through its ministers to appear before committees, to answer for decisions that have been taken, to explain the approach we've taken. I think I'm right in saying that my colleague Mike Russell's been in front of the COVID committee 10 or 11 times, for example, along with multiple other ministers, which is as it should be. But it is about striking the balance where we sometimes need to implement change very quickly, and there is a necessity to that. I mean, if the member has any thoughts on how we could do it differently, I'm happy to discuss those.
Can I thank you for that response, and in some ways it's reassuring, the response that you've given, and I accept, as do the rest of the committee, that it's a very difficult juggling act that government have had to do over the last few months.
Yeah.
So can I move on? Sorry, Minister.
So I was going to say, but it's also been challenging for the Parliament as well. I mean, I think all too often we in the midst of all this, we've lost track of the fact that everyone has faced considerable challenges in terms of different ways of working. And I think, frankly, that the committees of the Parliament deserve enormous credit for the way they have risen to that challenge with hybrid meetings, with virtual meetings, etc. They found the way to keep the show on the road. So it's not just that the government has faced challenges, we have, but so too has the Parliament.
No, that's, I absolutely agree with the points that you've made. The committee wants all instruments to be as clear as possible so that there is no confusion as to what is required by all of us. Can I ask how the Scottish Government ensures that what is law and what is public health guidance is made clear? Because there is a degree of confusion about where different pieces of advice and guidance sits.
Right. I'm going to ask Stephen to come in on the process that we follow, and then I'll answer the general question.
I mean, I think in general terms, it comes down to communications and being as clear as possible about what regulations do and don't do. And then obviously there's quite a wide-ranging suite of guidance now in relation to COVID activity, and that's given a lot of thought and attention within government before any changes are made about how do we communicate that as clearly as possible so that people who are affected by it do understand it. So I think it's, for us internally, it's been clear about what the legislation does and what the guidance will need to say, and then communicating that publicly. And as I said, I think that's an ongoing process which we're always trying to improve.
And I'm not going to sit here and claim that we get it absolutely right all the time, because there are occasions where people will interpret guidance in a way that's at odds with what's intended. We, as constituency MSPs, will all come across cases like that where we've had to go back and just double check what's meant, and often it is a lack of clarity of words, or perhaps people interpret them what's being said in a way that suits what they're looking for. So, as I say, I'm not suggesting that this is perfect, but I think there's the balance is right, and I hope we're quick to respond when a legitimate issue is raised with us, both internally and externally, with MSPs of all parties coming forward with queries that then alert us to the fact that there may be a degree of misunderstanding of what's intended.
Yeah, and I think, Minister, you would probably agree that given the nature of the pandemic and the kind of level of guidance and instruction that has been given, people do get slightly confused because things change so quickly, and I think that has been one of the issues as well.
Yeah, I mean, I recognise that criticism, if we're going to call it that. What I would say is that all of us are having to adapt to the challenges and the changing challenges that the pandemic sets us. And that's why it's important that as parliamentarians we do our bit in articulating to the public what it is we're asking them to do, and how exactly they're required to do it. But I accept it. It's often a fast-moving situation, and some of the public are finding it difficult to keep up.
Can I thank you for that response? Can I ask you now about the 28-day rule? Because you'll know that the committee has previously highlighted the number of negative instruments coming into force almost immediately and breaking the 28-day rule. And again, committee appreciates that this is often necessary, but want to ensure it's only used when it is absolutely necessary. So can I ask you, Minister, how you monitor these breaches to ensure the legislation, which is not so urgent, doesn't breach the 28-day rule?
Well, I'm happy to give you an assurance that is something we take extremely seriously, that I take extremely seriously. When we find ourselves in a situation where we would be at risk of doing that, I'm always careful to look at why this has happened, to see what the justification for it is. It's not something we do as a matter of course. Sometimes it's circumstances out with our control that lend itself to that. And I certainly, wherever possible, seek to ensure that the relevant committee conveners and the PO are cited on the reasons for it. But I do offer you the assurance it's not something we do lightly, and it's always a matter of regret when this happens. So I'll bring Stephen in to add to this.
Just going to add to that when we breach the 28-day rule, there's a requirement that we write to the presiding officer to explain why that has happened. So it has to happen every time we breach the 28-day rule. And that internally goes through a process of officials having to explain why we think that's necessary, and then ministerial clearance, including the Minister for Parliamentary Business and Veterans. So before we get to the point of breaching the 28-day rules, we know we're going to have to justify it very clearly to the Parliament.
Okay, thank you. Minister, can I just finally ask you about the use of emergency coronavirus-related instruments? And I accept that you may not be able to give me a definitive answer to this, but do you expect the use of emergency-related instruments to begin to fall?
That's an interesting question. I could speak with more certainty about primary legislation around the coronavirus. We've had 3 separate pieces of legislation, 2 directly through this Parliament. We have been doing a degree of horizon scanning to see if there's anything likely to arise in the next, say, 6 months that would require activity through primary legislation in particular. The only thing that is immediately apparent to us is, of course, the potential impact of the coronavirus on the forthcoming election. So there is a dialogue going on just now across the Parliament and with the Parliament about contingency plans that we might require to address that. As I say, I could speak with less certainty about emergency instruments that might be required in relation to the pandemic because you don't know what might arise. But again, these are only brought forward with out of necessity.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that response, and thank you, convener.
Okay, thank you, Mary. Before moving to Stuart McMillan, can I just go back, Minister, to an earlier point Mary raised about the clarity between what is law and what is guidance? Do you think that when ministers are addressing the chamber, they make it clear enough what's required by law and what's guidance? Because you'll probably be aware some members have asked to have that made clearer.
Yeah, I mean, my own personal reflection when I've heard this is I think it is made clear at the time. However, as someone touched on earlier, there is a very large volume of information out there, and perhaps we need to reflect on how we reinforce that. But I certainly think of multiple occasions in the chamber where the First Minister or someone else has articulated how this will be done and what form it takes. And then there's subsequent misunderstandings. So I think that's something we are alive to.
I think Michelle Ballantyne would like a supplementary there.
Yeah, it was just to pick up on that point because the expression is used all the time, the rules. And I think in Parliament it's perhaps the incumbent on us to use more technical language and talk about regulations or guidance. And I think that's actually where a lot of the confusion comes from when the First Minister or whoever's talking about it talks about the rules. The rules could be either. So I think that would be the message to take back.
Yeah. And I think, as you said, it pertains to all of us because we all use that phraseology as MSPs. Yeah.
Now to Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Minister, and also your team. Just before I've got some questions regarding Brexit, but just before I go on to those questions, I just want to highlight one point, and that's regarding the questions from Mary Fee. I sit on the Parliament's branch executive committee of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, and last Thursday, Friday was the BIMR, the British Islands Mediterranean Region Regional Conference, and the issue of delegated powers came up quite a lot in some of the dialogue, and some of what you've said today, Minister, is basically replicated in other parliaments across the region, and certainly colleagues from Wales highlighted us that we've got 28 days, they've got 21, and the similar issues of sometimes the delegated powers being superseded because a new set of powers comes in, so you have that issue regarding the subject committees or the relevant delegated powers committee there. So I just thought I'd make you aware of that because it might be worthwhile if your officials wanted to potentially have some dialogue with some of the other parliaments within the region, because it might actually provide some assistance and also some comparisons with what's happening here and elsewhere.
I mean, it's a reasonable point. I mean, there is a regular dialogue takes place with our officials and officials in other devolved administrations, but whether it goes wider than that, I'm not entirely sure. So it's something to think about.
So certainly questions regarding Brexit.
certainly obviously COVID seems to have put Brexit at times somewhat in the shade, but certainly moving to the legislation arising from also from the UK leaving the EU. Minister, you wrote to this committee in August estimating that around 50 SSIs and 70 UK SIs affecting the devolved matters will be needed by the end of the transition period on the 31st of December. A number of the SI notifications have been sent since then. Can you provide an update on these figures, please?
Okay, and you know, as I've said before, this is very much a moving feast. Interestingly, had I been able to speak to you at the original date, I'd have been saying to you that there were to be, I think, 16 UK SIs, for example, relating to the Northern Ireland Protocol. It's now 18. That's the way in which it changes. But to answer your direct question, and this is an estimate, we believe that a total of 71 SI notifications and SSIs will be required by the end of the transition period. 33 UK SI notifications in total, of which 16 currently sit with the Parliament, and the Parliament have agreed to Scottish ministers consenting to 2 further SIs during September. There are 38 Scottish SSIs, of which the majority are expected to be laid in the Parliament in October and November, and that there is a particular pinch point in late October, early November, which we're working very hard to manage. There's considerable effort goes in to try and smooth the numbers so that committees don't become overwhelmed, but there is an unavoidable issue towards the end of October and the first week or so in November, which will be extremely busy.
Can you provide a bit of further information as to what that pinch point is? Is it just a timing thing, or is it something else?
I'll bring, do you want to come and see
Yeah. I'm happy to speak to that. I mean, there's effectively 2 waves, we think, of EU exit activity. The first one's happening now. That's the UK SI notifications, which we're sending to the Parliament, and quite a large number have gone over the last couple of weeks. More are happening as we speak. We think this is the critical period for that type of activity. Scottish SSIs, we think most of them are going to come towards the end of October, start of November, and we think particularly for the Rural Economy Committee. So we've been doing quite a bit of work internally to make sure that's not all coming in the same week, for example, and also where possible to make sure that any domestic SSIs aren't happening in the same week. So at the moment, we think we've got the figures down to a more reasonable number, but it's something that we're actively managing and making sure the Minister is able to input to.
Okay, fine.
The problem is we've got a hard backstop, so finding flexibility is increasingly difficult. But we are doing everything we can. In conjunction with the committees, we work very closely with them to manage these flows.
Okay. Are you confident that these SIs and SSIs will actually provide for the legislation that's required by the end of the year?
Insofar as that's possible, yes.
Will further legislation be required beyond that date, for example, under the terms of the withdrawal agreement or the future relationship with the EU?
Well, I'll bring Stephen in to talk to the planning assumptions we have at the moment.
It's certain, I think, that there will be more legislation required. I think it's really difficult to say at the moment what that looks like, because there is no agreement currently. We don't know what the shape of that's going to be and what speed the UK government wants to move at. We don't have ourselves great intelligence of what that might look like. We gradually get more and more from the UK government as time passes, and where we're able to share that within confidentiality requirements, we'll definitely do that.
Okay. The committee has previously said that it was grateful for your regular updates and also the updates to the subject committees on the EU-related legislation. You restarted this practice recently, and will you continue to provide updates on the volume of legislation over the coming months, such as the breakdowns of the number of SSIs and also SI notifications?
Absolutely. It's an approach that's worked extremely well. So I had one-to-one meetings with the relevant conveners when we returned from summer recess, if one calls it a summer recess. We do follow-up letters, and it's not just the volumes. We're trying to give them an understanding of the topics insofar as that's possible as well. And they will be quick to come back looking for any further information. And, you know, it's a good relationship, I have to say. It goes back to what I said earlier about this has been an exercise in the Parliament pulling together to keep, as I said, the show on the road. And I think overwhelmingly it's worked well.
Okay. And so my final set of questions is just regarding also what you spoke about a few moments ago, and well, the number of SIs and SSIs, and also the timescales. So what impact will this actually have on the ability of the Parliament, bearing in mind the 28 days rule that we actually have, so the impact on the Parliament to consider the SI notifications before the deadline for the Scottish Minister's consent?
Yeah, I mean, as far as we're able to, we're going to try to ensure that in as many cases as possible, the full 28 days will be allowed. Part of the challenge we've got is we can't be certain when, for UK affirmative instruments, when they will be taken in the UK Parliament. So we have to work back from their laying date. So in some cases, it might seem that our planning assumption is less than 28 days, but where that is going to be the case, we'll engage with the UK government and ask them to make sure no debates take place in the relevant instruments until the Parliament has been able to form a view on whether Scottish ministers should consent. So we might not be able to achieve that in all cases, but we'll do it for as many as possible, and particularly those where the Parliament identifies something that they think is significant or critical and they want more time to look at it.
Okay, no, that's helpful. Thanks very much.
Yes, thank you. We'll move in a second to Michelle Ballantyne, but just to remind Mary Fee after that I think she has a follow-up question, so don't go away. So, Michelle Ballantyne.
Okay, and officially good morning, Minister. Now, obviously, there's clearly a substantial amount of legislation to go through before the end of this parliamentary term, and no doubt a big challenge for you. But I'm really wondering about the non-COVID and non-EU withdrawal legislation in terms of the work that we've got to do there. So could you tell us a little bit about how the Scottish Government is prioritising all of that other stuff that needs to come through to make sure that the necessary SSIs are actually laid before Parliament in time and that committees get time to scrutinise them?
Is this primary or just secondary legislation, or both?
Both. Everything that you've got to do beyond COVID and EU withdrawal.
So it's a weekly monitoring exercise. Stephen nodding his head there. We are alive to all of these challenges. And of course, the unknown, two unknowns in all of this is any increased Brexit related instruments, which would add to the burden, and COVID as well. Those are the two things that we don't know about. But looking ahead, with a fair wind and the continuing cooperation of the Parliament, I would be optimistic that we can get through the primary legislative programme. Now, as you know, earlier this year, on behalf of the government, I took some pretty tough decisions in terms of not proceeding with legislation, simply because of the circumstance we found ourselves in. We wouldn't, as a government, shy away from doing that were it necessary again, but if the Parliament continues to be able to function as it is, and we found the different ways of working, then I'm not foreseeing that as being necessary around primary legislation. In terms of secondary legislation, we have put an enormous amount of work, and I say we, I mean the officials, to minimise or to separate out the instruments that are absolutely essential and those that we might want to have, but we don't need to have. So we've been very pragmatic all round in our approach. Sometimes I think maybe some of the committees, when they look at the volumes of what they're getting, maybe don't see it that way, but that's the approach we've taken and will continue to take. And as I say, on a weekly basis, we are monitoring any issues that arise. And we also work very closely with the committees around any flexibility we can offer to accommodate their workload on legislation. So sometimes it isn't possible because of other pressures to get that stage 1 report out by the date we were looking for, or a tweak of a deadline for stage 2 or whatever. And we do try to accommodate that, although it is increasingly difficult to do so given we're coming towards the end of the parliamentary term. But I'm optimistic.
That's good. Well, that actually does lead me nicely into the second point I wanted to raise, and that's around the committee. Often it considers a package of SSIs, particularly around a new act that's come through, such as the Social Security or Transport Bill, and I'm sure this is relevant as well to subject committees, because it would really help to be given advance notice of that so that we can kind of prepare for packages coming through. And I just wondered if you know there are any sets of instruments coming through, and are you able to keep us updated on their progress so that we can timetable as well around it?
I mean, I think that's a perfectly reasonable ask, and we will look to provide that information for the committee. I mean, sometimes where it's possible, we try to bunch instruments. They're not necessarily on exactly the same subject, but if you have a number of affirmatives coming at the same time, we'll engage with the subject committee to try and time them in such a way, if that's possible, that they can have a session with the CABSEC or the relevant minister to get those moved on, and then focus on the other business they have. And it's always a two-way conversation around that. But I actually thought that you were getting that kind of information. If you're not, then I'll undertake to address that.
That would be helpful, thank you. And are you aware of any coming, any groups?
Not off the top of my head.
No.
We're either, and I think I would just say I think we're better at that now than we were previously. I've been around long enough to remember concern from the Parliament that we're getting instruments in different weeks which related to the same topic. So for bill implementation work, we try and make sure the bill teams are identifying if there are packages of instruments and making sure we have early dialogue with the clerks of this committee and with the relevant subject committee.
Well, I'll undertake to have a look at that and write back to the committee if there's anything we need to draw to your attention.
Okay, thank you. So that moves me on to a problem we have spotted that's arisen actually specifically today, and I suppose it relates to what you were saying earlier about the need to implement things change quickly and things happening quickly. But as we approach the end of the session, obviously there's going to be more pressure on the timetable for scrutinising bills. But I really want to ask how you can help to ensure that the gaps, particularly between bill stages, are where they're tight, that you're giving sufficient time for the committee to do appropriate scrutinisation. And I think today, as I say, we've got the revised Delegated Powers Memorandum for the Social Security, what is it called officially? The Administration, I highlighted it somewhere here, Social Security Administration and Tribunal Membership Bill. And we are only looking at that revised memorandum today, and yet stage 3 is being heard this afternoon. So any questions we have on it, there isn't actually time for us to ask and get an answer to that before Parliament has to, in effect, vote on stage 3. And that does pose a problem. I think it poses a problem in terms of a democratic deficiency. Now, obviously taking on board the pressures you're under, I guess the question to you is how can we be assured that that isn't going to happen routinely over the next few months? And can you put steps in place to ensure that we do get that scrutiny time?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't, to be honest, I wasn't aware of this conflict that's arisen today. I mean, the timing for that bill was set quite some time ago. And we're also, another consideration that kind of feeds into this is the nature of the bill. If it's a bill that is contentious, if we anticipate a lot of amendments, there's a great deal of interest around it, we will obviously work with the committees around what time they think they need, sometimes between the stages. The reverse is also true, that where a bill is setting out to achieve something that we would all be supportive of course it has to get the relevant scrutiny. Normally that takes place in the early stages. And, I think the bill this afternoon only has 4 government amendments to address. But let me take that away and think about that, because I think it is a reasonable point to make. We're not living in a perfect world. Sometimes circumstance arises that makes situations like these necessary. The other thing I would kind of say in response to this is, of course, we can all point to an individual bill and its relationship with an individual committee. I and my officials have to take an overview, and we're trying to piece everything together and make the timings work in terms of resourcing of the bills. So if, for example, we have a stage 2 coming up that's going to require a lot of amendment, both from the government and from the opposition members, which is, of course, is rightly part of the process, then we have to have an additional resource put there to make sure we can stick to the timings around that bill. But it has an impact on other bills. So it's a bit of a jigsaw for me, trying to make sure that everything works according to the plan, but also to take account of committees come back and saying, we might need a little bit more time here. Can we have that? Can we move this in order for us to do another piece of work on another piece of legislation? So I would just offer you the assurance that there is considerable effort and thought goes into this. But, you know, we're not perfect, and we'll reflect on the point you've made.
No, I'm absolutely sure you don't do it off the back of a fag packet, so to speak. I think probably what we would ask is that, because obviously normally you don't get, you know, you try to avoid getting amendments at the stage 3 stage, but if that has happened, if you could just give us a sort of heads up in advance that there is going to be a revision, and then at least we can think about how that impacts and affects. I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. I think that's me because the last one was answered.
Hopefully we can now pass to Mary for a question.
Thank you, Convener. Minister, I wanted to briefly ask you about Scottish Law Commission bills. You'll know that there's a review group has been looking at this issue, and this committee has worked quite closely with the Scottish Law Commission. And Minister, you'll know that committee capacity has a major impact on the handling of Scottish Law Commission bills. And given the situation with COVID, withdrawal from the EU, timetable of government bills, we're coming up to the dissolution of Parliament, and there is a squeeze on committees and on this Parliament on how they do their work. And I'd be keen to hear your view, Minister, on what the government can do to minimise the impact that all of this has on the progression of Scottish Law Commission bills going forward.
I'm a big fan of the work that the group has done. I think it's really important that we have a good look at what the recommendations are. I hope they are as I'm anticipating them to be, because I think the working group and the government are very much on the same page on this issue. You appreciate that it would have been impossible to anticipate at the outset of this session the combined impacts on the Parliament's time of both COVID and Brexit. Nevertheless, I think what we have to do is to look to the future. What would future better ways of working look like? My own view, and it's just a personal view, is that I think the role of the DPLR committee could be tweaked in order to take perhaps a more significant part in that. I'm certainly keen to see some of the SLC bills come forward in the next session. I mean, an obvious example is movable transactions, which would have benefit for the economy, and that's just one example. We obviously have defamation going through at the moment. So I think the Parliament, I hope, will respond positively to the report that the committee's working group has. We are certainly hoping to be able to respond positively to it as well, to be very supportive. And hopefully in the next session, session 6, we will be approaching SLC bills in a slightly different way to ensure that there is a flow of these bills through the period of the Parliament. I think it would benefit all of us to do that. So I certainly offer you the commitment. I'm very enthusiastic about this particular strand of work.
That's very helpful, and I appreciate your response. And it's something that this committee has looked at frequently over the last while. And one of the things that committee would be keen to see going forward is almost that SLC bills aren't seen as political pieces of work. They're not government bills. They're completely separate. So there should almost be a separate timetable to progress those bills, and your commitment into looking at how that can be done is certainly very welcome.
Yeah, I mean, I think you make a reasonable point there. If we're looking at different ways of doing this, unfortunately, some people will look at some SLC bills as being quite sterile, but there's some really good stuff in there. I think we've worked with SLC as well about developing their approach to shaping bills, their consultation approach. We need, I think, to improve the willingness of people to participate in SLC consultations around legislation. There's perhaps a view out there that the likelihood of those bills coming to fruition is limited, and therefore people don't necessarily engage at that early stage. I think if we can send a clear message in the next Parliament that there is a very strong chance of these bills coming forward, or at least some of them coming forward, we'll get a more robust engagement at an early stage. The bill will come forward more developed, and then we have to work out how the Parliament would wish to process those. Now, you know, it's, I suppose the risk here is that some subject committees might be concerned about a different approach if we took that. They might feel that they ought to have any particular bill sitting with them for scrutiny. But I don't think it's beyond the wit of this Parliament to find a better way of dealing with SLC bills. And I would certainly be disappointed if we were sitting here 5 years from now, whether it's me or anybody else, any of us, not able to reflect that we made considerable progress in this regard.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you, and thank you, convener.
Thank you. Stuart, I think you have a follow-up.
Yes, thank you, convener. Just it's on your final point there, Minister. I think it's this committee and also with the various members that we've actually had in this committee, certainly in this session and in the previous session, have shown that the Parliament actually can deal with the SLC bills and can deal with them efficiently and effectively to actually help the legislation that Scotland actually has. So I welcome your comments about potentially tweaking of the role of this committee, but the proof is already there that this Parliament and this committee can actually do that work.
I think, I mean, obviously it's a matter for the Parliament whether it was prepared to tweak the remit of the committee, but it strikes me that would be a way to increase perhaps the volumes of SLC bills. I think that's the frustration. We all, you know, we have made progress in SLC bills, but there is a frustration that there are a number that have not progressed, and one that is cited as movable transactions. And the government has also expressed its support for the principles around that. So, yeah, as I say, you know, hopefully in the next Parliament we'll be doing this slightly differently and making even greater progress around the SLC bills.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. Does any member have any further question?
Just saying, I think that would be extremely welcome, because I totally agree with you on the movable transactions. That should have been dealt with and through, because it would have huge benefit economically to business. So it's a shame that it's still sitting.
Well, as I said, none of us could envisage the impact that COVID and Brexit combined has had on the work of the Parliament. That said, I think we've done a significant job in terms of keeping the show on the road legislatively. If you look at the number of bills that the Parliament has progressed, I was looking before I came in at the number of stage one bills that this committee's looked at, and then the stage two consideration, I think it's 16 and 11. So over a very short period of time, I don't need to tell you that about your workload, but it's an illustration of how the committee, the Parliament has continued to function.
Thank you, Minister. I think that's been a very useful, open and frank discussion. I think the relationship seems to be in a good footing. Hopefully that will continue. I think our substantive point today was about the Social Security Administration and Tribunal Membership Bill. Just for the record, I should say that the standing order requirements on the timing for this bill were met, as I understand it, but it was in the shortest time possible. And I think the takeaway is, regardless of whether a bill seems to be important or less important, from a point of principle and scrutiny, we really need the time to ask the questions and consider the answers. I don't know if you have any closing comments you'd like to make.
So I would just say I wouldn't use the language of less important or more important. It's more, I think what I was touching on earlier is you can anticipate, or you will see with certain bills, some of them will require more time than others because of the nature of them. That's all the point I was making. But I absolutely take the point about the Social Security Bill, and we'll continue our dialogue about the council tax issue.
Put it on the agenda for next time. So, well, thank you again, and we may follow up, of course, by letter if there's any more questions that we come to as we discuss it. Now, I'm going to suspend the meeting briefly to allow you to leave, but remind you to avoid, use the social measuring protocol as you go. Thank you very much indeed. Yes. Yeah. No, no. So thank you. We now proceed under agenda item 3, where we are considering instruments subject to the made affirmative procedure. No points have been raised on SSIs 2022-79 and 288. Is the committee content with these instruments? Thank you. Under agenda item 4, we are considering instruments subject to the affirmative procedure. No points have been raised on the following draft instruments: Census Scotland Amendment Order 2020 and Human Tissue Accepted Body Parts Scotland Regulations 2020. Is the committee content with these instruments? Content. On the human tissues regulations, I noticed that the list of those the Scottish Government consulted focused on medical groups and did not include public or religious groups. While not something the committee needs to consider, would members be content if we highlighted this to the lead committee? Content. Thank you. Under agenda item 5, we are considering an instrument not subject to any parliamentary procedure. No points have been raised on SSI 2020-293. Is the committee content with that instrument? Content. Thank you. I now move the meeting into private.